Good evening. The content of the following program is solely the responsibility of the producer, Brookline for Everyone. All Brookline residents are welcome to use BIG's resources as members. Visit brooklineinteractive.org to learn more or to support BIG. Welcome to tonight's debate, where we'll hear from the two candidates seeking to represent the 15th Norfolk District, covering most of Brookline in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. Current Representative Tommy Vitolo and former Brookline Select Board Vice Chair Raul Fernandez will speak on some of the critical issues facing Brookline and the Commonwealth: housing, land use, transportation, and combating climate change. Tonight's debate is sponsored by Brookline for Everyone, a grassroots organization of Brookline residents who want Brookline to be economically thriving, racially inclusive, and environmentally sustainable by allowing more homes to be built throughout Brookline and by providing greater resources for housing our low-income neighbors. The debate is co-sponsored by the Brookline High School Climate and Food Justice Club, a community of student activists working to make Brookline High School, the world, more sustainable and just. The debate is also co-sponsored by Biking Brookline, who work with all users of our streets to promote cycling as fun, friendly, and safe form of transportation that improves mobility in Brookline while promoting health and the environment of Brookline and our planet. I'm Jared Johnson, and the Executive Director of Transit Matters. Transit Matters is a technical advocacy group that provides smart, people-focused solutions for issues facing the T. We're also big supporters of transit-oriented development and transit-supportive land use. I'm also a board member at Abundant Housing, a statewide pro-housing organization that fights for the creation of housing at all levels and the preservation of existing affordable housing. There are many issues facing Brookline and the Commonwealth, from deeply unaffordable housing, especially for our low-income residents, to some of the nation's worst traffic and a series of crises at the MBTA, along with record temperatures and sea level rise impacting vulnerable communities. Of course, it's not all bad news, from historic MBTA multifamily zoning at the state level to landmark climate and transportation legislation in DC. And hopefully we'll hear some solutions-oriented answers from our candidates here today. The candidates will be giving opening statements, responding to a series of questions, followed by closing statements. We'll alternate between the candidate who answers first, and they'll each have 2 minutes to answer the question, followed by 30 seconds to respond. We flipped a coin before we got started to see who starts first, so let me introduce you to Raul Fernandez.
Hey, thank you, Jared, and thanks to our host for having us here, and to Brookline Interactive Group for hosting this as well. And thank you all for watching. My name is Raul Fernandez. I'm a Brookline renter, a BU faculty member, a union member, a dad, and a former member of the Select Board in Brookline. I'm also running to be your next state representative. Today you're going to hear two different visions for the future. To me, it's clear that we have a legislature that too often is making decisions about us without us. Whether it's through secret committee votes, indifference and inaction on our home rule petitions, or choosing political expediency over meaningful progress. In this campaign and during my time in public service, I built power alongside those who need it most: residents in public housing, older adults on fixed incomes, working families struggling to afford to call Brookline their home. If we prevail in this campaign, there is no question that those people will have more power after our election than they do today. As those who have seen me work at town meeting and on the select board know, I bring a sharp equity lens to every policy area, including housing, climate, and transportation. And it's personal for me. My wife and I both grew up in public housing, me in New York and her right here in Brookline, and now we're renters in Coolidge Corner. We've experienced our housing system from many angles, and we know how broken it is. Brookline is our home, and we know the real fear that comes from worrying that a rent increase could displace us, not just from our home, but from our schools, our friends, our community. These experiences have informed my comprehensive housing platform. What it comes down to is that housing should be abundant, affordable, and accessible. And an essential part of that is rent stabilization, which, as far as I know, I'm the only candidate in this race to support. As the only renter in this race, I see it inexcusable that the legislature failed to address comprehensive housing reform this session. It's further evidence that we need more reps who personally feel the urgency of this crisis. Meanwhile, the crisis at the T is a perfect example of legislative inaction. Public transit should be safe, reliable, and fare-free, but we'll never get there if we allow the T to fall into disrepair. Transportation also accounts for 42% of our carbon emissions in Massachusetts. 42%. So significant investments in public transit need to be a top priority in the next legislative session. Climate action is also personal to me. Growing up in the Bronx, I saw asbestos dumped from whiter communities in a lot across the street from my home. And this year, the state did exactly the same thing, dumping asbestos a stone's throw away from public housing in Chelsea. These experiences are why, when our select board created a zero emissions advisory board, I made clear that it had to have an environmental justice seat, and now it does. Our legislature and the climate movement desperately need more voices who can speak authoritatively about environmental justice, and I'm uniquely positioned to be that voice. Brookline deserves a representative who chooses courage over convenience, who will press with urgency and work diligently to ensure that real, meaningful progress is felt by those who need it most. On housing, climate, transportation, and a host of other issues, I'm ready to be that representative, and I'm excited to dive into these issues today.
Thank you. All right. Representative Vitolo.
Thank you. Thank you to Big, to Jared for moderating, and for everyone who helped put this event together. My name is Tommy Vitolo, and I have served as Brookline State Representative for the past 4 years. I've been active in local politics and government in Brookline for more than 15. In 6th grade, growing up in a scrappy New England town, my parents lost the ability to make ends meet for just a moment. And we lost our 1,300 square foot home. I know what it is to be vulnerable, and I know what government can do to help people when and where they need it most. I moved to Brookline 20 years ago to pursue a PhD in systems engineering from Boston University. And when I eventually got it, I took a job working for Barack Obama's EPA, for Democratic Attorneys General, for the NRDC and the Sierra Club, fighting to close coal-fired power plants across the country against the wishes of their owners. And we had tremendous success. I gained expertise in energy and climate, and I brought that expertise to the State House, where I helped to shape and pass 2 climate bills in the past 4 years. The climate bill signed by the governor last week includes a provision born in collaboration on my front porch with town meeting member Jesse Gray, and it allows Brookline and 9 other communities to restrict the installation of fossil fuel heating systems in new construction and in gut renovation. I've carried that expertise and the understanding about collaboration and cooperation with me to the State House. And understanding the way to get things done, collaboration and cooperation, has helped me not just with the climate bill, but helped me to shape and pass a police reform bill, voting rights expansions, legislation that increased funding for affordable housing and requires communities to allow more market rate housing to be built. We passed mental health care and physical health care reforms. We funded public ed at significantly higher amounts. And we voted to protect immigrants and members of the LGBTQ community. We passed an abortion law so powerful that Vice President Kamala Harris came to Boston less than 2 weeks ago to meet with me and about a dozen of my colleagues to learn more about that bill. I'm proud of the work we've done in the legislature, and unquestionably, there is more work to do. I'm not satisfied. I look forward to tonight's conversation, and I look forward to talking with you on your front porch or in your hallway. And if I don't get there, you should feel free to call me on my cell phone, 617-872-8921.
All right. Raul, this past legislative session, a number of housing policies were proposed or enacted, including the MBTA multifamily zoning initiative, aimed at increasing housing supply based on the reality that Massachusetts has a housing shortage of more than 200,000 homes. What are your thoughts on that policy, and what other policies would you support and advocate for to provide communities the right tools to build abundant, affordable, and accessible housing?
You know, I do think that is a good policy, and I'm glad that it's in place right now. I know our town is working to figure out how we can make sure that we are in accordance with that policy. I'll tell you this much: we cannot move fast enough to change our zoning to allow for the kind of abundant multifamily housing that we need in our communities. The reason for that is whatever we do today, it's going to take a decade or longer to really realize the benefits of it. And so for me, the work that I've done on the select board is multi-pronged. It is about making sure that we have a residential exemption for those folks who need it. I worked collaboratively with folks on a small area fair markets rents designation for Brookline, which allowed folks who could not use a Section 8 voucher in Brookline the ability to have that voucher cover the cost of housing in Brookline, and we've seen the positive impacts of that. Everything from a senior property tax exemption, which I was the only select board member to support and thankfully passed at town meeting, and critically, the real estate transfer fee, which is something that I and others fought for, got passed at the local level. We passed it in 2019. I remember going there with our town administrator, Deborah Brown, one of the co-petitioners, and showing up, speaking and testifying at the State House. I don't remember our representative being there with us while we did that, and fighting for the passage of this bill. It has been years now, and we have not seen the real estate transfer fee been taken up. And by the way, not just ours, but plenty of communities have submitted real estate transfer fee legislation and haven't had it heard either. We've done the analysis, and according to our assessor, if that bill that we passed locally would have passed at the state level soon after, we would already have $50 million for permanently affordable housing, to preserve it, to create it. Those are the kinds of policies that we need.
Thank you. Tommy, same question.
Sure. So the bill was passed as part of a broader economic development bill, and I proudly voted in favor because we do need more housing. That is the key to dealing with the housing crisis. We simply need more housing. And that bill requires 175 communities to allow adequate housing. It doesn't ask for one or two to shoulder the burden. It recognizes that we need housing across a broad spectrum of eastern Massachusetts. Different styles of housing at different price points, all near mass transit. And so you're darn right I voted for it. And I'm glad that my opponent has recognized that the legislature did something in the past 2 years. My opponent also mentioned the real estate transfer fee. I also showed up for that. You know, working in the legislature is showing up every day, not just when the camera's on you. And not only did I file the home rule petition, not only did I testify on its behalf, but I advocated for it even though I knew the likelihood of it passing is very low, because it's not substantially local in nature. And that's why I co-sponsored the state level bill, even though the parameters set at the state level bill don't make complete sense for Brookline. I'm confident we can fine tune those when the time comes. My opponent talks about $50 million of missing money, but he fails to recognize that legislation at the state level does take time. It is deliberative. There are 351 different communities, 160 different reps, and getting things done requires the time necessary for collaboration and cooperation amongst communities that don't always see eye to eye. I'd note that my opponent has not advocated for increasing the CPA from 1% to 3%, something he had the ability to advocate for on the select board and something that could have funded more money for affordable housing immediately. That is a tool the town does have, and we haven't used it.
Thank you. All right. Raul, your response?
Sure, and let's just be clear here. My opponent was not in favor of the real estate transfer fee. I'm not sure if he is today, but I know that in 2021, he was not. He rejected becoming a co-sponsor of that bill. He simply wasn't for it. So he filed it because it was his duty to file it once it passed as a home rule petition here in Brookline. And that was the work, and I've seen my opponent, unfortunately, take too much credit for the work of activists and advocates in our community. That needs to stop.
Thank you. Tommy, your response?
Clear. There's no success yet. There's nothing to take credit for. But my opponent, in speaking for what I believe and what I've said I believe, is completely out of line. I believe it's a good bill at the state level. I filed it at the local level. I have advocated for it continuously. And I would appreciate it if my opponent would stop misspeaking about my actions, which are, for the record, on the record.
Thank you. All right. Tommy?
I'll just say briefly, I'll be happy to share the email where Tommy says to a constituent that he's not in support of it.
I'm
supportive of it. Yeah. That's it.
All right. All right. Tommy? Due to decades of underfunding, residents of BHA and state public housing properties face unacceptable living conditions with unacceptable environmental conditions. How will you prioritize residents of public housing and ensure that these conditions are changed promptly?
Sure. So look, I know what it's like to live in tough housing conditions. At the local level, I have successfully earned earmarks to fund renovation of existing units, kitchen and bath, fossil fuel free. We've gotten 2 bond earmarks to do exactly that. I had secured a $500,000 cash earmark in this year's economic development bill that we were not able to pass yet, although it is still in consideration, and we do have until the end of the year to get it done. I'm hopeful that we will. I've also supported in our budgets at the state level using both state revenue and ARPA funding to dramatically increase the amount of money the state has spent on state level public housing. We did half $500 million within the past year. And so we are prioritizing housing. I'm doing it. The legislature is getting there. It's taking some time. I want to also add that at the local level, we have the Colonel Floyd development, which is on Marion Street. It's got about 60 units of really tired housing. In fact, it's 2 stories tall with no elevator, and it's housing for seniors and the disabled. I was able to successfully pass a home rule petition that allows the town to replace those 60 units with 115 units of brand new housing appropriate for its residents. It increases the number. It certainly adds to the dignified living conditions of those units, and it does it fossil fuel free. So I've been there doing the work, and I will continue showing up to do the work to prioritize folks who live in Section 8 housing, as well as in Brookline Housing Authority properties and public housing across the state.
Rel, same question.
Sure. Let me tell you, this has been a hallmark of my time here in Brookline, is working to elevate the concerns of folks who live in public housing in Brookline, to elevate the fact that there even is public housing in Brookline, which so many folks seem to not have known previously. When we launched this campaign, the very first letter that we sent out was to residents in public housing. And as I mentioned, that is personal to me as someone who grew up in public housing and whose wife grew up in public housing right here in Brookline. And that letter said one simple thing: I see you and I will be with you. And it's not because pandering or any of those kinds of things that politicians do when they're trying to get votes, but this is a community that matters to me greatly. I'll give you some evidence to support that. I worked with others to create and co-chair the Brookline Housing Authority and Town of Brookline Working Group. We recognized that there were issues that the state was falling down on, most notably funding and even attention to what was the plight of the folks who live in public housing. We in Brookline actually put money, our own ARPA money, which, by the way, could have been spent elsewhere. But because of the state's underfunding of public housing, we decided to put $6 million of our ARPA funding toward renovating BHA properties, which triggered $10 more million that we were able to get from the state, $16 million of investment. I also got passed and got started a racial equity advancement fund. We were able to use a portion of that fund to actually start to fund a BHA tenants union so that BHA residents have significantly more power to advocate for themselves than they do currently. All of this to me is again personal and important, and I will continue to make sure that we prioritize lifting up folks who are in public housing and to make sure that they're not just part of this campaign, but they're actually part of the way we legislate.
Tommy, your response?
There's no question that both federal and state government have underfunded public housing for 50 years. I've been in the legislature for 4 of them. So we have a lot of catching up to. This actually sounds a lot like, I'm sure, the conversation we'll have about the MBTA. There's a lot of catching up to do. And I'm glad that I'm part of the group of people who are working to help us catch up. We've made tremendous progress investing in subsidized housing over the past several years, and we're going to keep making progress.
Rel?
The other thing I want to add here too is that So much of our conversation about housing is about the private market. We need to start to move more housing to the public market. So we have Brookline Housing Authority properties, and that's great. We have some affordable units to own. We need to start investing in making sure that there is a greater abundance of publicly funded housing, including for middle income folks. One of the ways that we can do that is having the legislature actually work not just to pass something like sports betting, but to pass comprehensive housing reform and that real estate transfer fee.
Thank you. All right. Raul, what steps can the state take to reduce serious injuries and fatalities to vulnerable road users, including pedestrians and cyclists? Should these steps include authorizing camera enforcement?
Well, I'll start by saying infrastructure. In order to be able to build the right kind of infrastructure so that folks feel safe in our community, we need dollars, and we need them at the state level, and we need to do everything we can with our existing budget, which is really strained. I'll tell you this much, we've had too many fatalities in our community, and I've seen too many others for pedestrians and cyclists. Sadly, very personally, I was there when one of our Boston University students named Chris was hit and killed by a bike, by a truck over by Landry's bicycles while he was riding on his bike. And I and a woman who I'd never met before and have never seen since were there to comfort him in his last moments. That was a failure of infrastructure. Now, today, if you go to that very same spot, you will see protected bike lanes there. We should not wait, need not wait for deaths, needless deaths, before we actually start to make investments in safe infrastructure. I'm not a cyclist, and I'll tell you why. One, I grew up in a community that was certainly not safe to ride a bike. And frankly, I'm scared to ride on our roads today. We need to make sure if we're going to actually slow cars down, it has to be by infrastructure. I will say this much too, I'm very much in favor of looking at automated traffic enforcement as well. The way that we do enforcement through policing right now is random and haphazard. It is rife with bias, as we've seen through the work of our task force to reimagine policing. And we need a better way to make sure that we are keeping people safe, slowing the roads down, but not causing other social issues in the meantime.
Thank you. Tommy, same question.
I do ride a bicycle all the time, and I ride the T all the time. My family, my wife, myself, my two children, we don't own a car. And we've lived in Brookline for nearing 20 years without a car. And I have been in crashes on a bicycle. And I've been to the hospital because of those crashes. So to reduce serious injuries, I have those creaks in my bones. I served on Brookline's Bicycle Advisory Committee for a decade. I know and understand the technical challenges we face and have victory after victory installing first paint and then curbs and physical infrastructure to protect bicyclists and pedestrians. I also voted in favor of Brookline reducing our speed limit from 30 to 25 on all local roads. My opponent voted against reducing that speed limit, but I know that a crash at 30 miles an hour and a crash at 20 miles an hour has a dramatically different impact on the pedestrian's chance of survival. And so I voted in favor of that. And when Brookline couldn't reduce all of its speed limits because of a technical difference in opinion between MassDOT and the legislators, we filed a home rule petition, and I filed statewide legislation to correct that glitch. We didn't get the home rule petition. It wasn't substantially local in nature, but we changed the law statewide. My bill changed the law statewide so that in congested areas, all roads that are appropriate could be reduced to 25, not just some of them. So we've done the work. I've done the work. Cameras, you bet. For bus station enforcement, for speeding enforcement, for red light enforcement, I'm in favor of them. I've co-sponsored the bills, and I'll continue to work with my colleagues to try to get it done.
Raul?
Yeah, I'm actually very proud of the vote that I took on this this speed limit warrant article that my opponent talks about, because he's actually misrepresented what the article was about and what my vote was about. The article would not have dropped the speed limit to 25 miles an hour across the town of Brookline in my speech, I said I would vote in favor of that if it did. What it did was allow the town to decide on a block-by-block basis where speeds, where the speed would be dropped. I'll use my next moment in time to talk more about this.
That's actually not what the bill was about. The bill allowed the town to reduce the speed from 30 to 25 town-wide, and that was made clear by Todd Corain and others in the position. And I did not misrepresent my opponent's vote. He voted no. He had the option to reduce the speed limit in our town, where our kids cross the street to go to school, from 30 to 25, where our seniors cross the street to go to the senior center, from 30 to 25. He voted against it. I voted in favor.
All right. Tommy? Several years ago, Brookline passed a home rule petition, as did half a dozen other cities and towns, including Boston, requiring a 1% to 2% real estate transfer fee on home and other real estate sales, with some exceptions, which would provide significant funding to our Affordable Housing Trust, but which has not progressed in the legislature over 2 different sessions. More recently, a coalition led by Somerville, Boston, and other communities introduced state enabling legislation to allow cities and towns to adopt real estate transfer fee. This garnered some support this legislative session, but hasn't passed. What is your position on the real estate transfer fee, both the Brookline home rule petition and the state enabling legislation? And specifically, what would you do to make sure this is approved in the year-end session or early next session to unlock the significant source of funding for affordable housing in Brookline?
So to be clear, I can't make sure of anything. It's a legislature with 160 members in the House and 40 in the Senate. I did file the home rule. I support the home rule. I also co-sponsored the statewide bill. The parameters on them are different, and I don't think either one gets it quite right, but I think that there's room to collaborate and to work to find parameters, exemptions, and so forth that do make sense. I've advocated for it with Ways and Means and with the Chair on Housing. I have spoken about it with colleagues. Again, both the home rule and the statewide. I think the home rule's chance of passing is very, very low because it's not substantially local in nature. I think it's much better chance that we pass it at the statewide level. But there is some pushback with respect to the CPA. See, the CPA allows towns to tax up to 3% of property tax to fund historic preservation, parks and open space, and affordable housing. And if a community isn't using that tool to fund affordable housing, it's not clear that the legislature will provide another tool to fund affordable housing. And that's a challenge because very few communities are at the CPA 3%. Brookline, for example, is at 1%. So it's hard to make the case when Brookline isn't using the tool it has now to fund affordable housing. It's a tough conversation because different communities have such different interests in housing. And so we'll continue to fight this fight. But I think the more important fight is the fight to get more market rate housing built across the region, which will push down prices, and inclusionary zoning will add more units at the same time.
Thank you.
One quick note on speed limits before I begin to answer this question is, unlike in the state legislature, everything we do is open to the public. You can actually find the video. In fact, I will gladly share the video where I speak on this very bill, and you can see exactly what it is that I said and what I believe. You don't need to rely on anyone else's characterizations but that. On this in particular, I am glad that my opponent has evolved on the real estate transfer fee. As recently as August 26th of 2021, he wrote to a constituent, "I am strongly opposed to it as it treats Boston metro communities different than rural communities." The thing about the way the real estate transfer fee works, it's not like money is leaving Brookline and actually going to other communities. The money we raise in Brookline, because of the very enormous high property values that there are in Brookline, that money actually stays here in Brookline. So there's really no reason to oppose it based on what it does to or for other communities. On the CPA, I'll just say this is, the chair of the select board and the other folks that have endorsed my opponent are driving the CPA right now. If he's supportive of this and they're supportive of this, I don't know why we're not at 3%. But he should ask the folks that are endorsing him why they're not at 3% right now.
All right. Tommy?
You know, my opponent was on the select board and had the opportunity to make the case on the CPA. He did not make it. The challenge with the real estate investment trust is it relies on using a statewide median housing price to decide who pays and who doesn't. The statewide median housing price, last I checked, was closer to $600,000 than $500,000. And over 90% of Brookline homes cost more than that. So it doesn't treat people in Brookline the same as it does in rural parts of the state.
Thank you.
And it need not. It is irrelevant to other folks outside of Brookline how other folks are being treated as it relates to a real estate transfer fee. This is about taking advantage of the tremendous wealth that's been built in Brookline. By the way, wealth that has been built as a result of redlining, where other communities were dramatically harmed by redlining. Brookline is a community that benefited from it significantly. We see that in the home prices and we see that in the demographics of Brookline. Passage of real estate transfer fee is essential to making sure that we do what we can to make that right and make Brookline more affordable.
Thank you. All right. Raul? Are you prepared to support legislation that may have short-term economic ramifications but will be important to combating climate change? For example, a ban on the sale of fossil fuel-powered cars or placing excise taxes on environmentally harmful products?
The answer is yes, with a caveat here, though. We have to make sure that as we take big swings, you know, we talked about that fossil fuel-free warrant article, the decarbonization warrant article. I was a co-sponsor of that warrant article, which was really essential to actually making sure that folks who might have concerns from an affordable housing standpoint or a racial justice or an equity standpoint were on board with that, with actually getting that passed, and it passed overwhelmingly in Brookline. I think it's important that we do that. I'm on board with opting us up to 100% for green for our electricity. We haven't had an opportunity to revisit our contract while I was on the board. I think that's going to be happening later this year, and I fully support opting up to 100%. But here are the things that we need to do. We need to make sure that environmental justice is considered in all of the work that we do. So how can we opt up and make sure that folks are taken care of? We need to figure out what that impact is going to be on the folks who are the most underpaid, the folks with the lowest incomes in our community, and make sure that either they have some kind of support to cover the cost, or they have a strong opt-out provision so that they're not impacted by that as well. We need to take big swings, but we also need to take care of people on the way. As I've said, everything that we do here, whether it's about climate or other issues, I think we need system-wide change. I think we need to take a really big and robust approach to it. But unfortunately what happens is because we do not have the right voices at the legislature, we end up passing legislation that hurts or at best ignores the people who need it most. An example of that was cannabis legislation, which I'm glad passed, but we were told would put money in communities of color and that there would be great opportunities for investment in communities of color. None of that has happened. I think the legislature is now trying to right that wrong, but that is what we need, voices at the beginning, not at the end of the conversation, to make sure folks have heard.
Thank you.
So to clarify, we did pass a cannabis bill just recently, and one of the things it did, and one of the things I made sure that it did in collaboration with the chair on the House side, was allow Brookline to expend its revenue from cannabis to support Black and brown initiatives, something that we put forward as a home rule, but again, I was able to ensure passed statewide. The answer to your question, Jared, is yes. I think there will be times when we need to take a short-term pinch for long-term gain, but the good news is we're nowhere near there. When we talk about offshore wind, the price ends up less than natural gas, and our electricity prices will go down for taking this big initiative that we have taken, passing 2 bills to make it happen while I've been in the legislature. Similarly, look at the price of gasoline. In fact, it's cheaper to own and operate an electric vehicle than a comparable gasoline-powered vehicle. When we look at housing stock, we see the same thing. The price of home heating oil, the price of natural gas is going up, 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 and electricity is not. And so, yes, I am willing to talk about taking a pinch for long-term gains, but there are so many long-term gains that we are making progress on right now that don't have a pinch, that actually keep people's budgets lower and more stable because they're not exposed to the fluctuating prices of oil, of gasoline, of natural gas. And with respect to environmental justice, the roadmap bill we passed 2 years ago included landmark environmental justice legislation. It's clear we're still figuring out how to implement it. The asbestos drop-off by MassDOT is completely out of line. The legislation is there. We need a governor who will execute that vision, and we're going to have that in our next governor, Maura Healey.
What we need at the State House is an environmental justice caucus that is going to focus on that work. Remember, we created this Zero Emissions Advisory Board, a 5-person board, really sound technical board, and I ensured that one of those seats was dedicated to environmental justice. We need folks in the State House that are not just thinking about environmental justice, but are focused on environmental justice. Too often, frankly, we, including communities of color, are used to get legislation passed and then jettisoned afterwards and forgotten about. We see that with the lack of the filling of seats on the EJ board at the state level.
Tommy?
I worked for 10 years traveling around the country, forcing the closure of coal-fired power plants by testifying in front of public utility commissions and in front of municipal governments. I know what we can do with respect to energy and climate, and I am working closely with my colleagues to get us there. That includes environmental justice. That includes keeping an eye out for consumers. But we're talking about real results in reducing emissions and saving our ecology.
Thank you. Tommy, as we think about increasing housing supply, the reliability and reach of public transit will be an important consideration. What should the state legislature do, and you as a state rep do, to support a robust, green, and reliable MBTA?
Just about 8 years ago, brand new Governor Charlie Baker asked to have the reins of the T. And the legislature at the time said, you want it, you got it. The legislature and the governor have made pretty good strides on capital investments. You've seen the dollars, you've seen the work. We saw it in the Green Line. And we've seen that the T is capable of making improvements. The building right next to us, 22 Tappan, the high school, is built over an MBTA station. And I worked with the T in the town to make sure that that station was built adequate for the riders, not just for the students. In fact, we met in this very room in that conversation. And the C line down Beacon Street has transit signal prioritization, which means that the Green Line gets the green light. The town had wanted it for years, but it took a personal conversation between me and General Manager Poftak to get the T to install that equipment during the COVID shutdown and the C-Line track replacement. And now the ride from Cleveland Circle to St. Mary's is about 7 minutes faster than it used to be. We're talking hundreds of hours a year for a daily commuter. So we're clearly capable of getting things done right. But in the big picture, the governor's failure to invest in people has resulted in the tremendous failures of the MBTA. We don't have enough operators. We don't have enough safety personnel. The National Transportation Safety Board shut us down over it. I expect the next governor will work with the legislature, not in spite of the legislature, not only to build out a 21st century transportation system, but also to hire the people necessary to operate it safely each and every day.
I'll tell you, the T does not work, and the truth of the matter that folks out there know is that it hasn't worked in a really long time. I would sometimes attempt to take the T to work at Boston University from where I live here in Brookline, and I would show up and wait as a full Green Line train would come and go with no room to get on it, and the next one, And after a while, I just realized it was just better to walk, even when it was raining, even when it was cold. And fortunately, I am in a position to be able to make that kind of decision. The T hasn't worked for a really long time, and we have underinvested in the T for a very long time. There's no question that there needs to be a change of leadership over at the T, no question at all. But what we also need is a state legislature that invests in it. And what we've seen over the years for a very long time, including recently, is dramatic underinvestment in the T, the same kind of underinvestment we've seen in public housing across the Commonwealth as well. What we need is to make a plan and to invest in that plan and to make sure that it prioritizes the folks that need it most. We have the ability now to make buses fare free. We should do that today. There's been enough study, enough pilots here and elsewhere. We know that it can work, and we know that it is going to create a more efficient, a more reliable, a more climate-friendly, and a much more affordable, for those who need it most, T. We have the 66 bus line that I've been working with partners in Cambridge and Boston to get a pilot going. We did get the "we've got you in the queue" response from the folks at the T. I'm going to keep working with our folks locally to push to make sure that we at least get that pilot going, because we know how well it's going to work for people. That line in particular was the second most traveled line prior to COVID. I think it's the third most right now, and it is an important connector. If we can prove that it works there, it can work anywhere in the system.
Thank you. Tommy, your response?
So, in the past few years, the legislature has been investing the capital dollars in the MBTA, and the governor has been moving money out of operation into capital, thereby underfunding the operating budget. But the good news is we are getting a new governor. We're getting a new governor in January. That governor, I fully expect, will be Maura Healey, and she's someone I support. We're going to see a better T then. It's going to take time. It's not going to be fixed overnight. It took 40 years to get into this problem. It will take some time to get out of it, but we'll keep working on it.
Thank you. Raul?
I mean, I just can't stress enough how bad the system is right now, and the fact that the federal government is dipping their toe in the water, is nearly threatening takeover right now. This needs to be an absolute priority. I'll say too, the legislature is out of session right now, and there is absolutely no reason why they need to be out of session right now. There are things that can be done, whether it's to address the issues at the T or some of the other issues that we've discussed today around housing. The legislature should come in session and address those issues.
Thank you. All right. Raul, what do you think are the benefits and detriments, if any, to the increasing use of e-bikes, and what role should the state play in encouraging their use?
Well, you know, I got a chance to see in New York where e-bikes are seems everywhere. You know what it looks like and how they work. Certainly an efficient mode of transportation, but one in which we really need to be thoughtful about, especially as it relates to safety. Actually, beyond e-bikes, I was driving the other day and making a turn, and someone was on one of those motorized skateboards coming screaming down the wrong way on Beacon Street in a bike lane. You know, we need to make sure that we've got you know, the right infrastructure in place so that everyone knows exactly where they're supposed to be and how they're supposed to be using the public way, but to also make sure that we're investing in alternative modes of transportation so long as they work. You know, we piloted the scooter program here in Brookline, and we saw what that looks like when people are able to just leave their scooters anywhere they want. Thankfully, we ended that pilot. You know, the real issue that we have here is the dramatic underinvestment in infrastructure, and that's where I would choose to focus our efforts, is making sure that as we think about all these alternative modes of transportation and making them work better for people, that we provide the infrastructure that keeps people safe.
Tommy?
Cycling is not an alternative mode of transportation. It is simply a mode of transportation, as normal and appropriate as all others. We absolutely do need better infrastructure, but e-bikes are a special beast because they can go quite fast, including in short distances and uphill. I co-sponsored the bill that legalized e-bikes this last session, another thing we were able to achieve. And we did something a little different than the rest of the country E-bikes come in class 1, 2, and 3. And class 1 is simply assistive. Class 2 has a throttle and goes up to 20 miles per hour. Class 3, 28 miles per hour, which would in fact allow you to speed on most local roads. We only legalized class 1 and 2 and not class 3. And the bicycling community was divided on this. Most, I think, wanted class 3, but we didn't go that far. We wanted to take it slow, as it were. I support e-bikes. I think they're really important for access. They're important for folks who have different abilities, whether it's their knees or their hips. And they increase mobility. They let people commute 5 miles each way, even in clothes like I'm wearing. So they're really an important way to expand transportation access, and that's why I support them. When it comes to parks and other spaces, it's appropriate to have restrictions. If you can imagine the Esplanade, where there are loads of walkers, mixing bicyclists there is not a safe way to do it. And we expect bicyclists, just as we expect pedestrians and motorists, to follow the rules of the road. And all of those groups do it most of the time when there's congestion, when folks are around. Occasionally they slip other times, and that's all right as long as we're being safe.
Raul, your response?
Yeah, the only thing that I'll add here too is that our primary responsibility also has to be for pedestrian safety. We on the select board actually put money, ARPA money, toward funding a pedestrian safety study, which is part of the larger Vision Zero approach to making sure that that folks are safe on our public way, and part of a complete streets approach as well. I think that we need to continue to think about infrastructure. Certainly the Beacon Street Bridle Path, which I know my opponent has supported as well, is an important aspect. Oh, sorry about that. I was just saying something nice about Tommy. I figured you might give me another second. But I think that's another important aspect, and we need to think about that kind of redesign everywhere.
Great, thank you. All right, so now it's time for our last question. So Tommy, how will you ensure that frontline communities, those are communities that are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change due to systemic injustice, how will you make sure that these communities are prioritized in climate policy?
There's no one way to do that. It's critical that we do that. We have a moral obligation to protect those who most need protection. And when folks are both in danger due to climate change and also lack the resources and equal access to power, we have an obligation to work hard to take care of them. And that has to come with each and every bill. That has to come with collaborating and working across the districts, working with legislators from rural and urban communities up and down the coast and inlands to make sure that we are meeting those needs. There's no magic. There's no silver bullet. It's hard work, and it's collaboration. And so we passed an environmental justice component of the roadmap bill, and in the bill we just passed, we ensured that investment in housing climate provisions centers and prioritizes low-income communities, communities of color, communities of a higher percentage of folks who speak English as a second language or with less proficiency. So there's no way to make sure of it except to show up every day and continue to fight for it. I've done that. You can see that in both climate bills and in other legislation that our legislature has passed in the last 2 sessions. There's no question it has not historically been a priority. But there's also no question in my mind that that's changed and that we are centering those communities. There's more work to be done in all communities, including those communities. It's not something we can sleep on. It's something we need to continue to work on. And you can be sure I will continue to work on exactly that, making sure that all communities move forward, including those with the least resources.
Raul?
There is a gap between folks that in their social justice work prioritize climate justice and those folks who prioritize racial and economic and other forms of justice. There's no question about that gap exists in Brookline, and I've been working to fill that gap and to bridge that gap. That's why it was so important when I joined the team that co-sponsored the decarbonization warrant article to make sure that folks who may not know enough about the big swings that we need to take on climate and are concerned about issues related to housing and racial justice, that I was there to bring those folks along. We need to work to close that gap, and part of the way we can do that is to make sure that when folks like me who go hard for climate and petitioners that have been putting climate bills in front of the select board on the way to town meeting know that I have always been a staunch supporter of the petitioner's motion, the original version. The one is the most robust version that is going to address the problems that are brought before us. They know that. And what I wish is that that some of those folks would go so hard as I do for those issues on racial and economic justice. We would be in such a much better place. Our legislation would be better. We would have better results. We would do the things that we say we want to do if we actually worked in league and concert with one another. And I'm in a unique position to actually bridge that gap. I'll say this too, when it comes to legislation at the State House, one, we need an environmental justice caucus that is full-throated and making sure that we will not let legislation pass if it does not center the communities most impacted by both climate change and the things that we do to try to avert it, and that we need specific commitments in writing and funding with follow-through to make sure that the things we say are going to benefit environmental justice communities actually do.
Thank you. Tommy, your response?
My opponent pointed out a fundamental difference between he and I. He said he goes hard for the petitioner's motion. And I think that highlights an important distinction between us. It's rare that the petitioner's motion gets it exactly right. The collaboration with advisory committee, with the select board, with other town meeting members, most often generates a better bill. And it did so with the fossil fuel free bills. I think it's important to listen to other folks involved and to collaborate, not to simply go hard with the first idea that comes out.
I've heard this before. My opponent has been trying to convince people that I'm not effective and that I don't collaborate. Frankly, doesn't collaborate is a dog whistle that's most often used by conservatives and moderates to refer to folks like myself who are vocal advocates for the things in which we believe and who do actually go hard on the issues that we care about, rather than supplicating ourselves to the leadership in the House. And I'm trying to focus on the issues here, but it's really hard to do that, to hear about the issues over the dog whistle that my opponent's been blowing.
Thank you. All right. So now it's time for closing statements. Tommy, you're up first.
With me, you know exactly what you get. You see me walking my children to Pierce School every morning. You see me at coffee shops in Coolidge Corner, Brookline Village, Washington Square, meeting with neighbors. You see me on my bicycle and on the T. You see me at community meetings at nights and on weekends. You see me. This election is not about values. You're going to choose between two Democrats, two lefties, two liberals, two progressives. This election is about leadership style. In my 15 years as a town meeting member, I was successfully able to pass legislation to restrict tobacco access, to create Brookline's clean electricity program, to protect town employees when they're at work. And I did that through cooperation, collaboration, and yes, compromise. That style is why the folks who know my opponent and I the best, the folks who are active in local government, are overwhelmingly supporting my candidacy. 6 out of the 7 members who worked with my opponent on the select board have endorsed me. 80% of all townwide elected officials are in my corner. 75% of town meeting doesn't agree on much, but they agree that Tommy Vitolo is Brookline's best chance at a good state representative. And it's not just the local folks. The statewide organizations who best reflect Brookline's values are also in my corner. Reproductive Equity Now is the state's pro-choice powerhouse, and it's endorsed me. So too has the climate powerhouse, Environmental League of Massachusetts. And the people who power Massachusetts the labor unions have endorsed me by a 5-to-1 margin. Representing Brookline for the past 4 years has been the honor of my life, but my work is not done, and so I'm asking you to back me. I'm asking you to vote for Tommy Vitolo, re-elect for state representative on Tuesday, September 6th, or you can vote early, because another thing this legislature accomplished earlier this year, a thing that I helped shepherd through as vice chair of the Joint Committee of Election Laws, is a bill that allows you to vote early. You can vote now. So whether or not you vote early, you vote on September 6th. I hope you'll vote to re-elect me, Tommy Vitolo. Thank you for watching tonight. Thank you, Brookline Interactive Group. Thank you, Jared, and thank you, Brookline for Everyone, for hosting this event. Good night.
Thank you. Raul?
First, just want to say thanks again to Brookline Interactive Group, to our moderator, Jared. Thank you, our hosts, and to everyone who stuck it out for the full debate. So I want to take a moment to actually tell you a little bit more about my background and critically how it shapes the urgency that I bring to these issues. I grew up in an underpaid family, ended up where I am today because I got lucky. When I was 4, a teacher recommended me for this talented, gifted program, which put me on this well-resourced path to Bronx Science and Boston University. Meanwhile, my under-resourced high school down the block was only graduating 3 out of every 10 students that went there. What that illustrates for me so clearly is that different opportunities lead to different outcomes. And if there's anything that we should be doing as leaders, it is to change systems that lead to opportunity for some and not for others. That's what I've done for the last 3 years on the select board, and I've been remarkably effective at it because I worked with so many people to deliver change. Real, meaningful, transformative change in a system that conspires to prevent it. I've seen firsthand that when we lead with courage and are driven by equity and add seats to the policymaking table for folks that are often excluded by traditional power structures, that we can deliver results even in the most unforgiving environments. I saw it happen through our working group to support the Brookline Housing Authority, which I created and led, through our task force to reimagine policing, which I created and led, and through our Small Business Development Committee, which I created and led, to name a few. I haven't seen that same urgency at the State House. We have state reps that refuse to make their votes public because they'd rather protect their relationship to House leadership than fight for the policies that constituents desperately need. We have necessary life-changing bills that die in committee every session. That includes the real estate transfer fee petition that with swift legislative action would have generated more than $50 million already to create and preserve permanently affordable housing. I'm running because the people who need it most can't afford a legislature that takes up sports betting before it takes up housing reform. And the folks who are advocating for those who need it most are with us. I'm proud to be endorsed by statewide progressive organizations like Progressive Mass and Mass Alliance, labor unions like SEIU 509 and SEIU 888, and progressive champions like Jesse Mermel, Miriam Ashkenazi, Natalia Linos, Joe Kennedy, Sonia Chang Diaz, and 28 leaders in Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, and other municipalities throughout the state. You can view all of my endorsers and detailed policy positions at raulforrep.com. And please know, try to hear over that dog whistle that my opponent's been blowing. I've been effective, I've been collaborative, and if you take a look at my website, you'll see exactly what I've gotten done. I'll end with this. Recently, in an interview with the Boston Globe, the Speaker of the House said he wouldn't extend the legislative session to take action on critical legislation because legislators already have vacation plans. We need reps who have courage to call that out, who know right now in our state action on our biggest crises like housing and childcare is more important than a trip to the vineyard. As your representative, you can expect me to be what you have already known me to be, a vocal and a progressive, effective advocate for progressive policies, someone who digs in and gets things
Raul.
done. To those watching,
Raul.
please join our campaign
Raul,
and cast your ballot for me,
Thank
Raul Fernandez, by September 6th. Thank you.
All right. Thank you to both of the candidates, Tommy, Raul, for participating, and thank you to our sponsors, Brookline for Everyone, the Brookline High School Climate and Food Justice Club, and Biking Brookline. We hope you learned a lot about the candidates seeking your vote to represent the 15th Norfolk District in the state legislature. And most importantly, we want to remind you to vote this primary election either by mail, early, or on Election Day, Tuesday, September 6th. And also visit brooklineinteractive.org to find this video after the initial airing. Thank you, and have a great night.